Hi, I'm Logan. This is Culp Course U.S. History, and this week we will talk about the one topic no one fell asleep in during history class, World War II. Now, World War II shaped American policy greatly after the war and saved America from the Great Depression. This would set up the U.S. as a leading nation with involvement in the UN later in the Cold War. U.S. foreign policy, however, before the war was very isolated, as many were afraid of becoming involved in another world war. Because of this, aggression by the Axis powers was virtually undisputed and led to what we call appeasement. Appeasement was essentially allowing the Axis powers to get away with actions that normally wouldn't have gotten away with, as example by the Italian invasion of Ethiopia and the invasion of Germany through the Rhineland and the Sudetenland, as well as the Japanese with invading China and Manchukuo. When the Axis powers took Poland, however, the opposition decided that they had enough and retaliated. While Roosevelt didn't openly join the war, he passed several acts that championed preparedness, such as Cash and Carry, the Selective Service Act, which was essentially the first peacetime draft, and the Lend-Lease Act. Aggression increased, however, when the Japanese bombed the USS Panay, and though the Japanese paid for the bombing, Roosevelt still issued an oil embargo on Japan. While the oil embargo was in place, however, the Japanese aggression persisted, and on December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. As stated by Roosevelt, yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. This led to Roosevelt's call for a declaration of war from Congress, and once it was passed, massive industrial production was ensued on the home front. In 1942, the War Production Board was established to manage war industries, and the Office of War Mobilization set production priorities and controlled raw materials with the war demand. Unemployment practically disappeared. The Office of Price Administration also froze prices, wages, and rents, and rationed commodities such as meat, sugar, and gasoline. Although to comfort the disgruntled labor unions that were very agitated with the massive war increase in production, the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act was passed in 1943 and allowed the government to take over all war-related businesses whose production was stopped or threatened by strikes. During the war was definitely not that cheap and was paid primarily through income taxes and war bonds, very similar to World War I. With war production increasing, over 1.5 million African Americans moved north to fill jobs. With this move came the continuous discrimination and segregation. White resentment led to race riots in both New York and Detroit in 1943. This led to the civil rights leaders to adopt the double V slogan, V for victory over fascism abroad, and V for victory for equality at home. The Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, was a civil rights organization formed in 1942 which helped lead civil rights cases to victory, like Smith versus Albright in 1944, which ruled that it was unconstitutional to deny membership in political parties to African Americans as a way to exclude them from voting. African Americans weren't the only ones affected by the war in 1942. An agreement was made with Mexico to let farm workers enter the U.S. during the harvest season, the Bracero program, without going through the formal immigration procedures. With a sudden influx of immigrants, this led to white resentment in Los Angeles, causing the Zoot Suit riots, which was essentially white people and Mexican Americans battling on the streets. The better version of Battle Los Angeles. At this time, the aliens were south of the border. Japanese Americans suffered the worst during the war, however. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, many Japanese Americans were suspected of being spies and saboteurs. This led to Roosevelt authorizing Executive Order 9066, authorizing Secretary of War to prescribe areas as military zones and resulted in over 100,000 to reside in internment camps throughout the war. This was challenged in the Supreme Court case Korematsu versus U.S. However, the Supreme Court upheld the court policy during wartime. Not all agreed, however, as Korematsu has been convicted of an act not commonly thought a crime. It consists merely of being present in the state where he was a citizen, near the place where he was born, and where all his life he has lived. Justice Robert Jackson, in regards to the Supreme Court case Korematsu versus U.S. With the massive amounts of men going overseas to fight, many women entered the workforce. This was promoted by Rosie the Riveter and liked such propaganda, but were still paid less than male factory workers. With all the war talk going on, domestic politics and other petty things, such as presidential elections, took a back seat. So no time at all, FDR was elected 4 times. Why? Because America. That's why. Back across the pond to Europe, however, the Allies invaded North Africa in 1942, and shortly after taking back North Africa, the U.S. entered Europe through the not-so-direct route of Sicily in 1943. This made Stalin upset, as he wanted the Allies to invade by way of France to put more pressure on Germany. That's not to say invading Italy, however, did not help the war, as the Italians ended up revolting against Mussolini's rule, and to make a long story short, after being recaptured in 1945, he was executed and promptly hung upside down from a pole in Italy. In 1944, Stalin got his wish on the French side invasion of the beaches of Normandy in June 6, 1944, resulting in the largest sea invasion in history, known as D-Day. After pushing through France and eventually to Germany itself, the American and Soviet troops met up and made the final push to Berlin, only to find that Hitler had committed suicide on April 30, 1945, with his wife Eva Braun, whom he had married the day before. How's that for a honeymoon? The unconditional surrender to the Nazi armies took place a week later on May 7, 1945, marking the end of the war on the European front. On the Pacific front, however, the war went off to just as bad of a start, with the surrender of over 78,000 U.S. troops in the Philippines and forced to walk the Bataan Death March, the prisoner of war camps on the other side of the island, where thousands would die. After this, the U.S. mobilized the part of its fleet that did not get bombed to do damage to control the Pacific, winning battles like the Coral Sea, Midway, and the Guadalcanal campaign, and attack on many island raids. These battles and many others were all part of the U.S. island-hopping strategy to work its way towards the heartland of Japan. Once the U.S. had won the bloody battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the U.S. was faced with a choice: attempt to invade the Japanese mainland or use their newly created atomic bombs to force the Japanese to surrender. The answer to this should be obvious. I mean, seriously, we're America. Bomb first, ask questions later. The atomic bombs killed over 100,000 people each, but practically saved more than enough American and Japanese lives, as Bushido was something no Japanese male would ever violate. The Japanese formally surrendered on September 2, 1945, with their only request being that their emperor be left as a titular or figurehead leader. During the war, there was some strategy talked about during the Allies and conferences like Casablanca, Tehran, and Yalta, with ironically Stalin being the most upset about the conditions in Eastern Europe. The Soviet government cannot agree to the existence of Poland, a government hostile to it, which ironically, Stalin would become that leader hostile towards it in the coming years. The first two were about strategy, however, and the latter was to discuss when Germany surrenders, being Yalta. Oh, and there was the Potsdam meeting, but all the cool guys of the Big Three were either out of power or dead. Rest in peace, FDR, 1945. A moment of silence. Anyway, post-surrenders, war crime trials were held for both Japanese and Nazi leaders. The Japanese mostly for deplorable prisoner of war actions, and the Nazis for that thing we call the Holocaust. You know, 6 million Jews killed, as well as 6 million other blacks, homosexuals, gypsies, disabled, and mentally challenged? Thought so. Also, afterward, the U.S. helped form the United Nations, a world diplomacy organization that worked a whole lot better than the League of Nations, not to be confused with the League of Legends. With the end of the war in sight, and the rise of the Soviet Union, the U.S.'s war powers was imminent. While the whole of Europe was the world's largest smoking pile of rubble, the U.S. was sitting on a fat pile of cash that was just waiting to be spent. In total, the war cost over 300,000 American lives and 800,000 wounded, as well as over $320 billion in debt, 10 times more than World War I. Stupid Soviets and their 20 million casualties always besting us as something. With the growing powers of the West and East, it would lead to what we now know as the Cold War, which wasn't so chilly as it would seem. Thanks for watching. See you next time.